How does your role change when acting as a dual agent?
Okay. Well, a dual agency is a provision that's carved out within the state of Illinois, and it permits an individual broker to be in a position that they can become a facilitator on a transaction. And typically, if you represent the seller on a transaction, you are then seller's agent and you are the seller's advocate, and you can provide representation to that seller, ultimately, hopefully, providing them with great information. On the counter side, you could be a buyer's agent. And then in that scenario, you're on the flip side, you're providing the buyer with certain information that will assist them to make the purchase. And you're also in a position as a buyer's agent that you can provide counsel to those individuals, both on price and on other details of the transaction itself. Now, the dual agency carve-out is basically a scenario where you sit on the fence as a middle person or a facilitator in the transaction. You represent neither party on it, and that means that under typically your listing agreement with the seller, if it's going to allow a dual agency, that's the start. So if that exclusive agreement that you have, your seller permits a dual agency, that ultimately means that you, under certain circumstances, would not be their representative. You would be the middle person in trying to strike a transaction together, put it together between the buyer and the seller. And so ultimately, the sellers need to sign off on that. Eventually, the buyer needs to be disclosed prior to or at the appropriate time in your contact and relationship with that buyer. If you perceive that they are going to be a candidate after proper disclosure to the buyer, then you can explain the step-by-step approach that you need to work on a transaction if, in fact, you are going to be a dual agent. Bottom line on the transaction for dual agency, you are not going to give pricing information or confidential information about either party. And ultimately, if you are in a position where the buyer permits you to be the dual agent, you are going to prepare the offer on his behalf, and you can complete certain functions within the transaction, such as assisting with financing, arranging property inspections, and other items that are involved in that. But you cannot give recommendations on pricing or recommendations on counteroffers to either parties along the way. So ultimately, how does that get handled? Let's assume that you have a property that's listed for $250,000 and you're the listing agent. You have a scenario that is created where there's a potential for buyer agency, and the buyer indicates that he would be interested in that. When you're preparing the offer, after giving the buyer the proper disclosure, now you get to the pricing levels. And the way that I always handle pricing is just the one that follows the book. Ideally, this is what you're going to be doing, because then you're handling it appropriately. And the way that works is, if your listing is at $250,000, you explain to the buyer. The seller's asking price is $250,000. Anything less than that would have to be negotiated. What would you like to offer? Whatever the buyer wants to strike as his offer price, you can record that information in the contract and then ultimately present that offer to the seller. And then it's a similar fashion for seller response. You present it to the seller, and the seller can accept the contract as originally written, and now you have a completed transaction. Or if the seller opts to make a counter proposal on any of the points, whether it's closing date, earnest money, price, or the like, then the seller can do that. You cannot give a recommendation to the seller, though, on pricing or what the seller should counteroffer at. So it's really important that in that listing process, that listing appointment, that the seller understands what their options are on it. They also have the option not to entertain a dual agency. And in that scenario, you are just a seller's agent. And if a dual agency opportunity with a buyer presents itself, you advise the buyer at that time that you're seller's representative only. And then, again, provide them with a disclosure that you can prepare the paperwork for them, but you're not going to be representing them in the transaction. So hopefully that's a kind of a long answer to a short question, but hopefully somewhat encompassing for the question.